At its peak, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer controlled more stars than there are in heaven. That was the boast, and for a time, it was barely an exaggeration. MGM produced more films, employed more talent, and generated more cultural authority than any studio before or since. And then, across a span of decades marked by miscalculation, debt, and structural change, it lost nearly all of it. The studio that invented the modern blockbuster mentality ended up sold, resold, and stripped for parts so many times that the famous roaring lion became less a symbol of power than a reminder of what power used to look like. The question worth asking is not simply what went wrong. Companies stumble. The deeper question is how an institution that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the arrival of television, and the collapse of the studio system managed to destroy itself more thoroughly in peacetime than any external force ever had. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was assembled in 1924 through a merger engineered by financier Marcus Loew, bringing together Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, and Louis B. Mayer Productions under a single corporate roof. Loew owned the theater chain. The merged studio would feed it. From the beginning, MGM was not simply a creative enterprise. It was a vertically integrated machine. Production, distribution, and exhibition locked together in a structure that made the studio's revenue nearly self-reinforcing. When audiences filled Loew's theaters to watch MGM films, the money cycled back through the same corporate entity. That integration was the foundation of the empire. Under Louis B. Mayer and production chief Irving Thalberg, the studio refined a factory model that its rivals struggled to match. Talent was contracted, developed, and deployed with industrial discipline. Greta Garbo, Clark Gable, Judy Garland, Katharine Hepburn, and dozens of others worked under the MGM banner. The studio released films at a pace that kept theaters continuously supplied and audiences continuously returning. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, MGM was the most profitable studio in Hollywood, generating tens of millions of dollars annually in an era when that figure represented genuine industrial dominance. The peak was real and measurable. Gone with the Wind, released in 1939, became the highest-grossing film in history in nominal terms, a record it held for decades. The Wizard of Oz arrived the same year. MGM's cultural footprint in that era was not metaphor. It was market position expressed through box office receipts, award tallies, and the simple fact that the studio's product defined what mainstream American cinema meant. But the structural crack was already forming inside the empire's greatest strength. The vertical integration that made MGM so profitable in the 1930s and 1940s was also its most exposed liability. In 1948, the United States Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Paramount Pictures that the major studio's ownership of theater chains constituted an illegal monopoly. The consent decrees that followed forced studios to divest their exhibition arms. MGM, like its peers, lost the captive audience pipeline that had underwritten its industrial model. Revenue no longer recycled automatically. Every film now had to compete on the open market for screen time it once controlled by ownership. Studios adapted, or tried to. MGM's adaptation was slower and more reluctant than most. The contract system, which had been a source of discipline and efficiency, became a cost burden as talent gained the right to negotiate freely. Television was pulling audiences away from theaters faster than any executive in the early 1950s had publicly admitted, and MGM's response was to double down on expensive spectacle, widescreen epics, and musical extravaganzas, rather than diversify into the new medium early or find a sustainable path to lower-cost production. The decision to sell the MGM backlot in Culver City in 1970 was both symptom and signal. By that point, the studio was under the control of financier Kirk Kerkorian, who had acquired a controlling interest not because he loved film, but because he saw asset value. The backlot sale, which included decades of costumes, props, and physical sets, raised short-term cash. It also dismantled the physical infrastructure of a studio that had defined itself through the scale and permanence of its production apparatus. The famous auction of MGM memorabilia in 1970 was not a nostalgic curiosity. It was a liquidation event dressed as a celebration. Kerkorian's ownership introduced a pattern that would repeat across the following decades. MGM as financial instrument rather than creative institution. The studio's library, thousands of films accumulated across half a century, became the primary asset that successive owners leveraged, sold rights against, or used as collateral for debt. United Artists, acquired by MGM in 1981, added further library value, but also added operational complexity and the financial weight of the catastrophic Heaven's Gate production, which had lost United Artists an estimated $40 million and contributed directly to that studio's collapse before the merger. The debt cycles accelerated through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Credit Lyonnais, the French bank, ended up holding MGM after a series of leveraged transactions left the studio technically insolvent. The bank sold MGM to a consortium led by Sony in 2005 for approximately $5 billion, a price that reflected the library's value more than the studio's ongoing production capacity. That acquisition itself was financed heavily with debt, approximately $2 billion, which the studio then had to service while trying to compete in a film market that had become vastly more expensive and fragmented. MGM filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in November 2010, listing approximately $4 billion in debt. The bankruptcy was not the result of a single failed film or a single bad decision. It was the terminal expression of a structural condition that had been developing for 60 years, an institution whose competitive model depended on integration it no longer possessed, whose debt load exceeded its production capacity, and whose ownership succession had consistently prioritized financial extraction over operational rebuilding. The studio emerged from bankruptcy in December 2010 under new management, with debt restructured and Spyglass Entertainment providing operational leadership. But the MGM that emerged was not the MGM that had roared in 1939. The James Bond franchise, held through Eon Productions, remained a genuine asset. The library remained valuable. The name carried recognition. These were real things. What was gone was the integrated studio machine, the talent infrastructure, the production volume, and the cultural centrality that had made MGM the definition of Hollywood rather than simply a participant in it. Amazon acquired MGM in 2022 for approximately $8.45 billion, a transaction that was again primarily a library acquisition, access to over 4,000 film titles and 17,000 television episodes. The lion still roars on screen. The institution that assembled those assets across the 20th century does not exist in the form that built them. The mechanism worth understanding here is not greed or incompetence in isolation. It is the gap between a competitive model and the market conditions that model requires. MGM was built for vertical integration in a regulated environment, and the 1948 consent decrees removed the regulatory foundation before anyone had built a replacement structure. Every subsequent decision, the backlot sale, the leveraged acquisitions, the debt financing, the library monetization, was made inside that structural gap. Some decisions were defensible, given the constraints. Some were not, but none of them, individually, caused the collapse. The collapse was the accumulated consequence of operating for decades without the structural conditions that had made the original model work. What lasted was the archive. What failed was the engine that produced it. That distinction matters for any institution that mistakes the output of a system for the system itself.